Welcome back to another episode of the DailyFlip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be talking about whether or not one of the largest education unions or associations across the United States should remain chartered in a national fashion, basically a support from the federal government, as the article from National Review would like to put it. To be honest, this is outside my depth, so take all my opinions lightly, though this news is interesting and the opinion piece is even more so. With that, if you want to participate in the daily debate, you can go down in the comment section. The question today is, should public sector unions be able to forcibly, and I say forcibly, mandate that their members are, or their people in their profession are members. So teachers are a great example. Now, not every union is like that. Not every school district is unionized, though. A lot of them are, and a lot of the teachers are meant or forced to be a part of the union. Now, you can make an argument for forced unionism in other places, though I think that argument falls apart, but I want to focus specifically today about the public sector side of things. So with that, let's get to our article that comes from National Review. Like I said, headline reads, "This left-wing education juggernaut doesn't deserve federal backing." Now, for those who don't know what we're talking about, that's fair. We haven't actually gotten into it. So let's give you a little bit of background from the first two paragraphs. Quote, "The National Education Association's real purpose is political. It doesn't merit a government charter. Last Wednesday, Senator Marsha Blackburn and Representative Mark Harris introduced the National Education Association Charter Repeal Act in an attempt to revoke the NEA's national charter, the third such attempt in 4 years. While this is certainly a headline-grabbing position, what would such a revocation actually mean for the nation's largest teachers union?" And obviously they are a union, though I would say they're a free-floating association, because I do believe that their structure is a little bit less rigid than some other unions. That doesn't mean that they're not a union, though. I think we need to leave a little bit of play in the joints when talking about this. Now, why is any union federally chartered? The question is not a rhetorical one. It's not, oh, why do these guys? It's a genuine one that I want to address. In order for a union to operate on a national scale rather than on a local scale, in a system that has pervasive government control and interaction and interfacing, especially with the Bureau of Labor and things of this nature, it makes sense that these different advocacy groups in this world that we live in become chartered or at least registered with the U.S. government, and therefore can be national actors that actually interact with a president who is possibly trying to get in the middle of negotiations. Now, should that actually be the case? Can they still interact with the government without necessarily needing a charter? 100%. So that rationale, and there are a few others that were presented when they were first chartered in the late 1800s, early 1900s. There are other rationales and other arguments, but I think that they don't necessarily warrant actually addressing, mainly because they are about the fact that they wanted to represent more people across state barriers. And now we live in a world where obviously the states still matter, but most of the education system is on a federal level. The money, the funding is administered on a federal level. Education standards are also administered on a federal level. So it gets a little less needed when everything is standardized versus the late 1800s when it was definitely not the case. So let's read from the article again. Quote, "Today's NEA, a lobbying and funding juggernaut with almost 3 million members, bears little resemblance to the humble professional organization of 10 local teacher associations with approximately 5,000 members on which the charter was bestowed 120 years ago. Ostensibly an educational organization, its real purpose is political. It spends millions on lobbying and campaign contributions, with over 97% of this money going to Democrats in 2024. Its recently released 2025 resolutions include characterizing President Trump's actions as fascism. By the way, the article notes that it was actively misspelled. They also went on to say, quote, backing the No Kings protest in Los Angeles in calling efforts to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education racist, spelled correctly. That's the National Review's little sarcastic twinge that they threw on there. There's no doubt about it. And here's the rest of what I think is actually important from this article. Obviously, you can go read the entirety of this article. It's linked below in the below the like and subscribe button down there. But here's what it has to say. Quote, if lawmakers want to alter the NEA, alter what the NEA does rather than outright revoke their charter, they could instead revise it. The NEA is unworthy of its federal charter, but it does give the federal government power over the organization. As such, lawmakers could place limitation on the NEA's lobbying and political activity, and importantly, authorize the Attorney General to enforce their requirements. Tinkering with its charter might be more effective at kneecapping its political activities. So that is part of the other argument, which is in order to be able to be an official lobbyer, this charter is actually effective in that front because it means that they're registered as such, or at least registered as an organization that can do such on the national level. Though I think that argument also gets kneecapped, and I'm using their exact word here, kneecapped. Because if you actually want to have an effect, you don't have to be federally charged to do so. You can affect it through state races. And that's the whole point of senators and congressmen. You can have different union bosses, and that makes it sound really bad, union heads on a state-by-state basis, basically chapter leaders on a state-by-state basis that are willing to back different candidates, give them money, give them attention, bring them to different meetings, rallies, and so on and so forth. So the power wouldn't necessarily be diminished, except for the fact that they might cross-fund in different locations, which is an interesting perspective. But should local politics be less important than the national politics? Say there's a teacher union favorite darling political candidate going out in New York and they're winning, so they don't necessarily need as much money, so they spend a little bit more in Nebraska in order to get their candidate across the line. Should New York politics be able, or at least New York money, be able to flow into Nebraska? Well, in the case of a national lobbying federation, it very well can. And I think that would be a worthwhile solution, which is limiting lobbying and influence game peddling and donations on that front. Though, of course, it does get tricky, because does that mean that I can't, as a normal person, if I'm really, really interested in giving money to Bernie Sanders or Ted Cruz or the Libertarian candidate Chase Oliver, if I'm really, really loving them in Virginia, I can't give money to them if they're running in a different state? I don't feel as though that's irrational, though maybe they're great advocates for the values that I want, and maybe I think that they will actually be able to push people of my preferred party, or at least the people that are representing us. Doesn't necessarily even have to be partisan in nature. So it does get tricky, but I think that would be an interesting review, and I think it would be a worthwhile review to actually look at this ability to make sure that their powers are limited on a federal scale and ensure that local politics is the most important place that they can have an impact. Now, of course, that is ham-fisted. That is the government telling unions how to operate. So then if you want to go the pure libertarian route, here's what you do. You take away the charter and you say you can interact however you want to, though this gives you no tax status protections simply for having the charter. You have to apply like everybody else, and that will be reevaluated on a normal basis rather than having a rolling charter. There you go. Look at that. Completely free market way of looking at it. You allow it to stand up on its merits or not, rather than allowing it to use a legacy charter. And then you possibly also remove the mandatory restrictions that some teachers have to go through to make sure that the same rule applies. That if teachers don't want to pay in and they don't see the value that the NEA provides, then they don't have to give their funds to it. They don't have to have money taken out of their paycheck, which means that it will survive on its own 2 feet if it is liked by the members. There you go. Look at that. Oh, we solved everything. Just kidding, of course. Can't solve everything. One of those solutions is more likely than the other, and I think that is the latter rather than the former. But actually, I take that back. I think that the latter is more likely than the former. But Either way, that doesn't mean that either are overwhelmingly likely, and we'll see how this one pans out moving into the future. Like I said, if you want to read this entire article, it will be linked in the description below the like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Spotify, as well as the Twitter handle at your Daily Flip, where I post the links to these episodes on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and the 6 and 6 podcast, which is 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less, on Tuesday and Thursday. So with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.